to find his Secretary of Defense. The chain of command doesn't work when the Commander-in-Chief doesn't know who to call. That's why we want to know who made the decision to withhold that information from the President. And although you publicly stated you are solely responsible, you've also informed this committee that it wasn't you who decided to withhold the information from the President. We were led to believe your 30-day interval internal review would shed light on that matter, but it includes no explanation of why the President and his staff were left in the dark. It makes no recommendations to improve communication with the White House, and unsurprisingly, it holds nobody accountable. We appreciate your desire to protect your subordinates, but it's important in democracy that public officials are held accountable when mistakes are made. This administration has gone to great lengths to avoid accountability whenever possible. But this is a matter of national security, and someone needs to be held accountable. Furthermore, I find it very concerning that the Secretary could be hospitalized for 3 days without anyone else in the administration even noticing. That suggests Secretary Austin's advice is not sought or heeded in the White House, even while military operations were ongoing in the Middle East. It also implies that the White House politicals, not seasoned defense professionals, are in the driver's seat on matters of national security, which is very disturbing. Finally, beyond the immediate need to inform the President, Congress also has a right to know of secretarial absence or transfer of authority. Ironically enough, none of this would have come to the attention if the White House hadn't demanded that the Department come clean to Congress and the public. Ultimately, our goal today is to understand how and why this happened so we can ensure it never happens again. With that, I yield to my friend and colleague, the ranking member, for any statement he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for joining us today. And I will point out to members that in a little more than a month, the Secretary will be back, and he will be here for the full posture hearing, which will go on considerably longer than 2 hours. So that accessibility I do appreciate from the Department of Defense. This is an opportunity to address an important issue. And I will say I agree with much of what the chairman said. I think the lack of transparency and clear communication about what was going on with the DoD, certainly with the White House, but also with Congress and others, should not be repeated. We need clearer, more transparent information about what's going on at the Pentagon. I do want to disagree with just one thing the chairman said about how during the time period when you were in the hospital, the commander-in-chief didn't know who to call. He did. The transfer of power was made. It was made to the deputy secretary. And if anything had come up, that's the way the system works. When the Secretary of Defense is out of commission for any reason, Deputy Secretary assumes those responsibilities and roles, and that was made clear throughout the Pentagon and to the White House. Now, the reason behind it was not, and that's where I think the lack of transparency is problematic. I think we need to understand the importance of the role of the Secretary of Defense responding directly to the Commander-in-Chief. The Commander-in-Chief should have the broad range of information about what's going on with the Pentagon. Even though, again, in this instance, there was no question who was in charge in that time, the transfer was done in accordance with the law and done appropriately. So I think it is appropriate that we have this hearing, that we have this discussion, that we hear directly from the Secretary. We have to work very closely with the Secretary as well as the Department to exercise our constitutional role of oversight of the Department of Defense. So to have those open lines of communication is crucial. I thank the Secretary for being here, being willing to explain that and take those questions. I do also want to emphasize that throughout this whole process, an incredibly complex threat environment. I think that's one thing on this committee absolutely everybody agrees to. There have been few times in our history when we've faced the set of challenges that we face right now. the war in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East, trying to make sure that it doesn't spread, the challenges that China continues to present, North Korea as well. Throughout that whole time, there is no allegation whatsoever that the Department of Defense was not completely on top of all of those situations. There was no instance where they were not doing their job to the utmost of their ability and in the defense of this country. In fact, I would point out that the coalition that Secretary Austin has been very responsible for helping to put together to stop Putin in Ukraine has been remarkably effective. And it's a testimony to Secretary Austin's leadership and the way the Department of Defense has been run on a day in and day out basis. I would also be remiss if I didn't point out that it would be helpful if the United States House of Representatives would be willing to allow a vote on the much-needed aid for Ukraine and the Middle East and to pass the appropriations bills the Department of Defense could desperately use to better carry out that job. But there's no doubt that the coalition that has been built has been incredibly successful. 2 years ago, when the war started, everybody assumed that Ukraine would be done in a month. Here we are 2 years later, and they are a sovereign democratic nation still, in large part because of the bravery of the Ukrainian people, but also because of the coalition that has come together to help protect them that the Secretary has led. Even in the Middle East, a chaotic and difficult situation, we have stopped that war from spreading. The response to the attacks and the tragic death of 3 U.S. soldiers in Jordan has, for the moment, blunted those attacks from the Shia militia. The Houthis are proving to be a much larger challenge in Yemen, but we have once again built a coalition to confront that challenge. So as we look at this question of what happened while the Secretary was in the hospital, and admittedly the lack of transparency that needs to be improved, let's not lose track of what the Department of Defense is doing right now to meet the national security challenges that we face. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the ranking member. Ms. Secretary, you recognize 5 minutes for any opening statements you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Smith, members of the committee, good morning. I'm grateful to this committee for your continued support for the Department of Defense and our outstanding troops. The U.S. military is the most powerful fighting force in human history, and with your help, we're going to keep it that way. The department is deeply focused now on meeting the pacing challenge from the People's Republic of China, on making the Middle East more secure after the October 7th terrorist assault on Israel, and on ensuring that Ukraine can continue to defend itself against Putin's war of aggression. So as always, we are focused on the defense of our nation. But I know that Congress has some legitimate concerns about some issues around my illness. So let me start by thanking all those who've offered me well wishes after my recent cancer treatment and hospital stay. I very much appreciate your kind words, and I received world-class medical care at Walter Reed. And I want to again publicly thank my doctors and the outstanding nursing staff. They expect me to be completely cured of my prostate cancer, which was caught early. And I continue to recover, and now I want to be very clear. There was never any lapse in authorities or in command and control. At all times, either I or the Deputy Secretary was in a position to conduct the duties of my office. But we did have a breakdown in notifications during my January stay at Walter Reed, and that is sharing my location and why I was there. And back in December, I should have promptly informed the President, my team in Congress, and the American people of my cancer diagnosis and subsequent treatment. Again, we did not handle this right, and I did not handle it right. As you know, I've apologized, including directly to the President, and I take full responsibility. I'm also taking responsibility for some institutional changes to make sure that this cannot happen again. It's not enough for me to pledge to do better. The system must be postured better to make the appropriate notifications when authorities are transferred. And my staff must be ready to carry all of this out. But let me be clear, I never intended to keep my hospitalization from the White House or from anybody else. That's why we immediately instituted changes to the way that the authorities can be temporarily transferred to my deputy and to the way that notifications get made. That's also why we conducted a 30-day review of the entire process. Now, because the review deals with the continuity of operations, its drafters wrote it as classified. But of course, we've shared that review with all of you. The 30-day review made 8 recommendations to me, and I've directed that all 8 recommendations be implemented. We put 2 in place already, and we're moving out quickly on the other 6. So let me quickly summarize them for you. We've made clear that we expect full information sharing when the deputy or another designated official assumes the functions and duties as acting secretary. We've issued written guidelines for clear information sharing between my staff and the deputy secretary staff if these scenarios arise. And we'll ensure that the department officials in the order of succession are familiar with and supported for the relevant processes. And we're moving quickly to develop a mandatory reporting protocol for personnel who support me or the deputy secretary in situations that might affect our ability to perform our duties and functions. Of course, we already have continuity of operations plans in place, and we'll continue to review and update those plans as appropriate. Now, even before the 30-day review, we already had made some changes. In the future, if the Deputy Secretary ever needs to temporarily assume the duties of my office, she and several White House offices will be immediately notified. That includes the White House Situation Room and the White House Chief of Staff. The key officials across the department will also be notified, including the Deputy Secretary, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and the General Counsel. And the reason for that assumption of duties will be included in writing. As you saw these new procedures in action during my hospitalization earlier this month. And finally, the DoD Inspector General is still working on his own independent review, which we fully support. Now, before I take your questions, I want to again make one thing very clear. At no time during my treatment or recovery were there any gaps in authorities, and there were no risks to the department's command and control. And from the time that I resumed my duties on January 5th, I fully participated in national security decision-making on events in the Middle East and about military operations in self-defense to protect our troops and our facilities over there. Again, we're moving swiftly to put some helpful new procedures in place to prevent any lapses in notification. And I am confident that we will not experience the same issues in the future. So let me again thank you for the opportunity to be here today and for everything that this committee does to support, to stand by the mission and the people of the Department of Defense, including their families. I know you understand this, but one of the best things that you can do right now to support them is to pass a full year appropriation. In doing so, we'll ensure that our troops get paid, that our civilian employees can stay on the job, and that we can continue to procure and field the very best capabilities to defend our country. We need the flexibility and stability that full-year appropriations provide. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Smith, I appreciate your leadership on that score, and I stand ready to assist you in any way. And with that, I'll be glad to take your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. The Chairman now yields his question time to the Chairman of the Subcommittee on Military Personnel, the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, help us get this straight. At what point during your hospital stay did you or your staff decide that the President should know about your hospitalization?
As I understand it, my Chief of Staff contacted the National Security Advisor and advised him that I'd been hospitalized on the 4th of January.
At what point during your stay was the 4th of January?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
How long into your stay was that?
Well, as we've pointed out, as has been pointed out earlier, I was admitted to the hospital
after you were hospitalized?
on the 1st of January, right.
Okay. Yes or no, did you tell your staff not to inform the President, anyone on your staff?
I never told anyone not to inform the President, the White House, or anyone else about my hospitalization.
Okay, so the 30-day review summary lays a lot of blame at the feet of your staff. It seems that would appear, correct? For the breakdown in the process? You've told us that you are responsible, but the 30-day review seems to blame your staff.
Well, the 30-day review pointed out that that there were some missteps, but there was never any ill intent or an intent to obfuscate. So,
1 year ago, you told me in this hearing room you had no regrets about what happened in Afghanistan. Do you regret what happened here?
I've said that we didn't get this right, Congressman, and we put measures in place to ensure that the notification process is improved going forward.
Mr. Secretary, who will be held accountable?
The transfer of authority was
who will be held accountable for this? This embarrassment.
Again, I take full responsibility, and we put measures in place to address the shortcomings.
Are you surprised the president didn't call for your resignation? I'm surprised, but are you surprised that he didn't call for your resignation?
The president has expressed full faith and confidence in me.
So you're not surprised that he didn't call for your resignation. Is it typical that the president would go 3 days without talking to his Secretary of Defense? Is that typical, or is that a regular posture? Do you usually go days without talking to the commander?
I mean, that can happen. It depends on whether or not the president's on travel. If I'm on travel, there are times when we do go days without direct communication.
So the big issue for me here is either the president is that aloof or you are irrelevant. Which one is it, Mr. Secretary? That you would go that the president would go 3 days without knowing that his Secretary of Defense is not on the job?
It's neither. The president is not aloof, and I participate in all of the.
Let me ask you this. Well, on January 2nd, while you were in the hospital, President Biden was vacationing in the Caribbean. Your deputy, who the president didn't even know had operational control, was on a beach in Puerto Rico. What kind of message does that send to our adversaries?
The key piece is that, number one, the deputy has the ability to, she has access to secure communications. She has the ability to participate in decision-making processes from wherever she is.
Mr. Secretary, our adversaries should fear us, and what you've done has embarrassed us. And let me sum this up by this. A leading Chinese propaganda outlet said that what happened to you exposed, quote, internal chaos. A leading Russian propaganda outlet said that your disappearance, quote, effectively compromised the
gentleman's time's expired. Chair now recognizes the chair now recognizes the ranking member.
First of all, let me say it is not remotely surprising to me that the Chinese and the Russians are not going to say anything positive about us. That doesn't come as a surprise to me. They seize on every opportunity to attack the United States. So I don't really take their word for what was going on. And a couple things to drill down on. One is it is fairly routine that the Secretary of Defense will be in places where you are not able to do everything you need to do, and that authority is transferred. I think a lot of people don't fully understand this. So can you walk us through, I mean, how often does it happen that you are in a place where you can't be as responsive as you need to be so that you pass the authority on to your Deputy Secretary?
Thanks. As pointed out in the 30-day review, there have been a number of times in the past where we transferred authorities because of my inability to have access to secure communications. And then once I had the ability to have access again to secure communications, that was transferred back. So that, and the number of times that that's happened is outlined in the 30-day review.
And was there, again, just to emphasize, was there any time during this process, in the first days of January when you were in the hospital, any time whatsoever when the Deputy Secretary wasn't in a position to fully carry out the responsibilities of the Secretary of Defense? Regardless of whether she was in Puerto Rico or Bermuda, Mexico or Mar-a-Lago or wherever, she was in a position to carry out all of the authorities that she had as the acting Secretary of Defense in that instance, correct?
She is legally and logistically positioned to assume the functions, and she was, you're right, in a position to be able to support the president as chief of staff, as he made decisions. So, Commander in Chief. So, she always has secure communications with her, just like me, and she has the situational awareness that's needed to be able to make effective recommendations to the president, and she, working with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and also the combatant commander, would propose options for the president in any situation.
Certainly. And one of the things I want to emphasize as this hearing goes forward is not to use this to the advantage of our adversaries, to use it as a partisan attack. There was nothing embarrassing about what happened here. There was nothing that makes us appear weak. The United States, as all of this was going on, as has been pointed out, was carrying out strikes against our adversary in order to protect our force. We were doing everything that we needed to do to meet the national security needs of this country. And if members of this committee incorrectly imply otherwise, they are merely giving aid and comfort to those adversaries that they claim to care about confronting. And I will also, one more time, emphasize that if we care about confronting our adversaries, rather than nitpicking the Secretary of Defense about his precise process in this situation, we should go ahead and pass the National Security Supplemental that the Senate has passed with 70 bipartisan votes to precisely meet those national security needs. Whatever Russia and Chinese propaganda machines may be cranking out about this situation, I assure you it pales in comparison to what they're cranking out about the fact that they think the United States is getting ready to abandon our ally in Ukraine. I would challenge any member on the other side of this aisle to claim that the Secretary of Defense not fully informing the President for 3 days is somehow more important than walking away from that obligation that we have made and that the whole world is watching us on. And with that, I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Chairman Mike Rogers. Secretary Austin, I first want to wish you a full and speedy recovery. And sadly, we're here today because of the failure to properly communicate Directive 3020.04 of the Department of Defense, which is critical information requirements through the chain of command to President Biden. As a grateful veteran myself, along with you, of the American Armed Forces, we both understand the crucial role of the chain of command to provide time-sensitive information to make the right decisions at the right time. When communications fails, there is an increased risk to mission success, but more importantly, increased risk to the servicemen and women. For this, to me, it's personal. As a 31-year Army veteran myself, having 4 sons who served in Afghanistan, Iraq, and in Egypt, and currently my district director is deployed in Africa, I just take this personally with the South Carolina National Guard, that your service is just so critically important. And I appreciate having worked with you before your appointment, and we need your proven capabilities more than ever, as we are in a war we did not choose, of dictators with rule of gun invading democracies with rule of law. It began February 24, 2022, with war criminal Putin invading Ukraine. On October 7, 2023, Iran puppet Hamas invaded Israel as the Chinese Communist Party threatens Taiwan. Sadly, Biden open borders for terrorists makes imminent more 9/11 attacks across on American families, and we need our state National Guards to be ready for duty. Every family actually should have a rally point when communications are cut with an attack. With the current global threats, today there are attacks on American and our allies by Iran in the Middle East. Would the lack of proper communications degrade our ability to respond?
Again, I would emphasize that there was never a break in command and control. We transferred authorities in a timely fashion. What we didn't do well was a notification of senior leaders. So. And we put measures in place to fix it.
I deeply regret the response we had was ineffective by delaying a response, and it should have been an immediate response on launch sites, and it should have been very effective, and there should have been no notice. And so what was done really has put American families at greater risk. And as I conclude, I want to express our sympathy for the family of Alexei Navalny, who was assassinated by war criminal Putin. His widow, Yulia, is a hero for the oppressed people of Russia. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here today and for your 40-plus years of service to the defense of our country. Again, just to sort of walk through one more time about the fact that there was no gap in terms of authorities and who was in control of the department. You went into critical care on January 2nd. Your staff then executed the law in terms of notifying the Deputy Secretary of Defense that she was in charge, and as a result, I mean, it was seamless. There was just never any moment where there was any absence of authority within the department. Isn't that correct?
That's correct, sir.
And again, it actually was the Armed Services Committee back in 1962 that passed the law that, again, made this process happen, again, without any action, special action of the Secretary of Defense. It's different, actually, than the 25th Amendment of the Constitution, where if a president is going to go under anesthesia or is incapacitated, it actually says in Section 3 of the amendment that there has to be a voluntary surrender. Again, going back to President Reagan, he actually executed documents, filed it with the Congress, notifying that that was going to happen. That's not the way the law works for the Department of Defense. Again, it happens, again, if the Secretary is unable to perform duties, then that's it. The Deputy Secretary is in charge. Isn't that correct?
That's correct, sir.
And then on January 8th, before even the 30-day review or any of the recommendations, you already moved to put into place a regulation that basically states that this now will be communicated in all instances to the President of the United States, so that the whatever confusion surrounding the lack of communication now has been now codified at the department to make sure it doesn't happen again. Isn't that correct?
That's correct, sir. And we had the opportunity to put those procedures in play when I went back to the hospital on February 11th, and it was there was timely notification in a seamless fashion.
So speaking of gaps, let's talk about the supplemental, because on February 13th, the United States Senate, actually by a vote of 77 to 21, it was more than the 70 votes that my friend Mr. Smith cited, overwhelmingly endorsed a package which will provide $60 billion to Ukraine, who is in a very dire state today. So 16 days later, we're here in this room. We're thankfully looks like we're going to move forward on a FY24 final package soon. But the fact is that nothing has happened in the House to follow up what the Senate did. The Speaker explicitly said he will let the House work its will in terms of next steps with the supplemental package. I think everybody in this room knows if the bill was brought to the floor, we would get an overwhelming majority vote, pretty darn close to 2/3. I've talked to some Republicans who said it would be 300 votes. What's the risk? What's that risk of that gap in terms of our national security and helping our allies?
Well, we're seeing the risk play out on the battlefield each and every day as the Ukrainians fight valiantly to defend their sovereign territory. And I would remind everyone that with our support in providing security assistance, they've taken back half of the territory that Russia seized. But each and every day, we see the Russians continuing to push and make incremental gains, and that's very troubling. And without our support, the Ukrainians will be outgunned in terms of artillery, and they'll also be at risk because of the lack of adequate air defense.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Turner. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lambert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for having this hearing. Mr. Secretary, we do wish you a speedy and full recovery. I would concur with the points brought up by the chairman. I believe most members of this committee are bewildered at how these events could transpire. I am primarily concerned with the effect of your actions and the actions of your closest advisor on the confidence of the American people. At a time when overall trust in the government is declining, Americans must still believe that the government can protect them from the growing threats in this world. And one of the most serious threats is that of a missile attack from Russia, China, or North Korea. I chair the Strategic Forces Subcommittee and am charged by the chairman with the oversight of our entire nuclear arsenal, including the command and control of our nuclear forces. Every day, our service members who maintain and operate the weapons systems that employ these destructive weapons are ready to act within minutes of receiving a valid order from the President that flows down through you or your designated representative. Today, many on this dais will speak about disruptions in chains of command. I will say that the most dangerous change of command to break is that which communicates orders to our missile silos, ballistic missile submarines, and strategic bombers. We will only deter attacks on our homeland if our adversaries are assured that we are capable and willing to respond in kind massively if necessary. Not only is our homeland threatened by adversaries' ballistic missiles, but will increasingly be threatened by hypersonic missiles. So all of these attacks are a matter of minutes, not hours. We can't afford to have the continuity of our nuclear command and control fail for even a minute. My district of Colorado Springs is home to the Cheyenne Mountain Complex, which is the primary site of our Missile Warning Center. The Missile Warning Center maintains an unblinking eye that buys the President and the Secretary of Defense critical minutes. In a crisis, they initiate the conference between the National Military Command Center and those in the chain of command. So, Mr. Secretary, my question is, when did the National Military Command Center become aware of your hospitalization?
The chairman of the Joint Chiefs was notified on, as I understand it, on the 2nd of January, and so the entire staff would have been notified at that time.
Was the Military Command Center informed that the Deputy Secretary of Defense had authority transferred to her?
When the transition takes place, there is a message that goes out to all of the key stakeholders, and so yes. Yeah.
And when was that message sent out?
2nd of January.
The 2nd of January. Was there we talked about seamless. It sounds like there was a gap between the 1st of January and the 2nd of January, or am I mistaken?
No, the 1st of January, while I was in the hospital, I could still, I still had the ability to access communications, and so I retained the responsibilities. On the 2nd of January, as I was admitted to critical care, it was determined that I would not have access. My communicators would not be able to provide timely access to communications for me, and so the decision was made to put the process that's in place in play. So.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair, I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you. Just a very quick summary of the law. If the President decides to launch nuclear weapons, the Secretary of Defense is not in the loop, which probably ought to come to our attention. Maybe we ought to make sure that the Secretary is in the loop, but by law he is not. With regard to the really important issues that face us, Mr. Secretary, we wish you well on your cancer treatment and your return to full health. You have an extraordinary service record. We note, if we care to understand, that it was your work, together with the President's, that assembled the support in Europe, NATO and the European Union, necessary for the Ukrainians to receive the support necessary to repel the Russian invasion. And you continue to do that. And I thank you for that extraordinary work. I will note that while we are spending our precious time, at least I think it's precious, on taking you and the administration to task, we are failing in our responsibility to fund the Department of Defense. We're now 5 months late in the appropriation process. It is the responsibility of the Congress to provide the appropriations, and we are not doing so. We're on our 4th or 5th continuing resolution. We are derelict. Not you, sir. It is the Congress of the United States and the leadership in this House that is failing to meet the national security needs of this nation. In the appropriation process, October, November, December, January, and February have passed, and we've not done our work. And we're spending our time here taking you to task. That's wrong. We're failing. Let me put it this way. The leadership in this House is failing. We have a supplemental appropriation, absolutely necessary for the defense of Ukraine. That has been languishing for months. The Senate has acted. this House and the leadership of this House has not acted? Is it that we are abandoning Ukraine? Is it that the Republicans in this House want to take responsibility for Ukraine's defeat? Apparently they do, because they are refusing to provide the necessary funding. Humanitarian aid, Israel, the replenishment of our arsenals, all are at risk because this House has refused to take action. Mr. Secretary, it is not you that are the problem. It's not what happened in your health emergency. That's the problem. You've laid out clearly that that has been resolved, that standard operating procedures were followed and will be even more so in the future. Thank you for your testimony, and thank you for putting that in place. When will this committee actually stand up for the defense of this nation? When will my colleagues on the Republican side of this committee find the courage to get the job done? 5 months have passed. The dereliction of duty is not yours, sir. The dereliction of duty is right here on the dais. Mr. Secretary, 17 seconds. If you'd like to comment on the necessity of getting the job done, please do so.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Whitman, for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, we wish you, again, continued recovery from your surgery. I'd like to go through a series of questions just with your reflection and yes or no. Is it standard operating procedure for your security detail to notify in real time the National Military Command Center?
To my knowledge, my security detail does not notify the National Military Command Center of my work.
So it's not standard operating procedure for your security detail to notify the National Military Command Center?
That's right. So.
Okay. Well, if it's not standard operating procedure, and you said earlier that you have mechanisms built in to make sure that transference of power takes place from you to the Deputy Secretary, then how does your security detail then close the loop in getting information to the right place? And how is the decision made that the Deputy Secretary was then in charge?
Well, the decision is really about whether or not we've reached a point where, I don't have the ability to continue to perform my duties because of lack of access to secure communications for a period of time. And that triggers the process that's established being followed, and that happened pretty quickly, and I think that they made the right decision.
So if it's not standard operating procedure then for your security detail to notify the National Military Command Center, which is the nexus for how information gets to the right place, so when issues of national security come up, the White House is informed because it's the National Military Command Center who's in charge of informing the White House. So that didn't take place according to you, and the standard procedure isn't there, and nobody in your office or your staff notified the White House, then how is it that people in critical decision-making positions then know when operational deficits take place, like you being in the intensive care unit that day and not being able to continue with your duties?
Again, by law, if I don't have the ability to execute my duties because of any reason, and in this case it was because of lack of access to secure communications, by law, the deputy assumes the roles and responsibilities.
Listen, I understand the law. The law is clear, but the law doesn't assure that there's continuity in operations and that people in critical positions know the current situation. So if something happens, the right decisions can take place in real time. The Deputy Secretary is in Puerto Rico. While she may have been advised or notified of a transference of responsibility, she stayed there, and it was a matter of if something really happened, was she in the right position to be able to do that? If the White House didn't know, the National Security Advisors didn't know, people in positions that would need to make decisions in case of, and we're glad that something didn't happen, but in case of, if that information isn't transferred, then there is indeed an issue of national security.
As I stated, there was never a lapse in authorities or command and control. And again, when the transfer is made, a message goes out to all the stakeholders that the transfer has been made, and so the communications specialists are positioned to route any incoming communications to the deputy that would have come to me. So.
Is it not correct, though, that the president should have known, that the National Military Command Center should have known, that the loop should have been closed, and making sure that everybody knew? The standard operating procedure should be that your security detail notifies the National Military Command Center.
The Joint Staff Chairman did know on the 2nd of January, and
Gentleman's
so,
time's expired. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Norcross.
Thank you, Chairman. Appreciate you holding this hearing, and to you, Mr. Secretary, we well wishes in your quick recovery. You've stated publicly that it could have been and it should have been handled better. That's clear. The 30-day review has been concluded. There was a number of recommendations which you had publicly agreed to implement, and you went further to talk about the Inspector General is also conducting that, and we look forward to it. And there should be a robust discussion. What there shouldn't be is partisan bickering and is trying to turn this into a political football. The idea of command and control of our military, of the defense of this nation, is of the highest priority to the men and women who serve here in Congress, those who wear the uniform, and certainly to every American who cares about that. I want to make sure that we fully understand, because apparently there is some doubt that there might have been a break in the command and control of our forces. Would you clearly state, for the record, was there ever at any time a break in that command and control?
There was never a lapse in authorities or command and control.
Because we understand that in the event that there was a national emergency, there was a kinetic conflict going on, there are a set of policies that take place in the event that there is ever a gap. If something were to happen to yourself or those below you, there's an immediate way of addressing that. And to go one beyond that, when it comes to nuclear command and control, there is very specific, and I have sat on that committee where we talked about, in the event that the president is not available, the vice president, there are clear and very specific steps that take place. Isn't that true?
That's correct.
So here we are. If this were to happen in a situation of somebody that you have control of that you didn't know, how would you have handled the situation?
If something like this happened to a subordinate of mine?
Yes.
Well, first of all, I would be concerned about that subordinate condition and welfare, and again, I would try to gain some understanding of what happened, and then I would ensure that we put measures in place that don't allow it to happen again, and that's exactly what we did here. And I would tell you that the president was foremost focused on my welfare, and then and ensuring that we had the right measures in place to streamline communications and to make sure that we were able to respond to anything in the future.
So as we are reviewing this, as we should, are there any other items that were not recommended to or lessons learned that you could share with us?
We're a learning organization, Congressman, and there may be things that we encounter in the future, or we consider in the future that need to be adjusted or changed. And as we encounter those things, we will adjust. But as a start, I think putting these 8 recommendations in place will help. We'd already done some things ahead of time to ensure that notification occurred in a very timely fashion. But if we learn more things going forward, we will adjust as needed.
Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Chair, I recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I certainly wish you a speedy recovery. I want to focus on the December 22nd date. That's the one I have the most difficult time with. I understand the other one was an emergency procedure where you were taken by ambulance to the hospital, if I'm correct. Is that right? The January procedure was emergency.
The January event was an emergency. I took an ambulance to the hospital. That's right.
But the December 22nd date, when did you know that you were going to have surgery on December the 22nd?
Well, I scheduled that surgery about a week prior to the actual surgery. Okay. I could lock in a date, and I took leave in order to do that, and I made sure that we transferred authorities to the deputy that day, and I resumed my duties the following day.
Okay, so you took leave, but you knew that you were going to take leave a week before the 22nd, correct?
That's right.
That's whenever you scheduled the surgery for the 22nd, that would be when you knew. But she was not notified until the day of the procedure, is that correct?
This was coordinated several days before, so I don't know the exact date when she was notified. But
okay, well, according to what we have, it appears that she wasn't notified. She was basically transferred the authority, but wasn't given the reason for the transfer of the authority. And I guess that's the thing I have the hardest time with, is not the emergency procedure, but it is knowing a week in advance that you're going to be under anesthesia, out for 48 hours, give or take some time there, and why she wasn't notified at that time that she needed to be prepared to receive the authorities at that stage. My understanding is that she was in Puerto Rico, not in continental U.S. at that time. Is that correct?
That's not correct.
Okay.
22nd, she was in the States.
Okay, she was in continental. Okay. I just think when we know that you, as the Secretary of Defense, there are 435 members of the House, 100 members of the Senate, but there's one Secretary of Defense. When we know that you're not going to be capable of making the decisions, that the sooner the person who is going to be in the position knows what and why, I think the better we as a country are from making sure things have happened or happen the way they should. I respect you. I wish you a speedy recovery. That's my primary concern. The emergency procedures, I think we've lessons learned the hard way. Won't happen again, no matter who's in the seat. I want to say this with regard to some of the comments that have been made about Republicans and who we want to win in Ukraine. Let me assure you, we want the Ukrainians to win, and we want Putin to lose. But one of the key things that many of us have asked for, that have voted for the Ukrainians repeatedly, is the enforcement of the sanctions against Russia. And simply sending the Ukrainians weapons or money is not going to win the war against Russia and Putin. The sanctions have to be enforced. That is something that I have personally asked for in the package that's coming to the floor, and something that I think those of us who know the issue recognize it's more than just weapons and money that Ukraine has to have to win the war. With that, Mr. Secretary, I wish you the best and certainly keep you in our prayers.
Chair, now recognize the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gallego.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Austin, for joining us today. Secretary Austin, I would like to thank you for your service and steadfast leadership, especially at this challenging time, and to express my wishes for you to have a full and speedy recovery. I recognize the deeply personal nature of your situation, and I'm also thankful for the committee for arranging this hearing. Mr. Secretary, I was deeply troubled when I learned the news that President Biden was not informed of your absence, let alone your hospitalization, multiple days after entering intensive care. While authorities surrounding the notification process for the Deputy Secretary of Defense to carry out new functions and duties is vague, it's clear that the chain of command is not. When I was an enlisted member of the Marine Corps, a corporal, I had to notify my superior if I could not report for duty. Just like there is accountability for the enlisted, I want to ensure that we are all held to the same standards, including at the highest level. So you can understand why the situation is very concerning to me and why I believe strongly that Congress should conduct robust oversight. In fact, as ranking member of the Intel and Special Operations Subcommittee, I understand the significant challenges that we face around the world and the reality that anything can happen at a moment's notice. We, in our senior department leadership, must always be prepared. It is clear to me that there was a breakdown in the department, and I appreciate the swift action that you took to conduct a 30-day review to examine the situation. I still believe that there are a number of important questions to ask and lessons to learn from this experience. Secretary Austin, your department just concluded a 30-day review to establish the facts and to inform process improvements. What are your primary lessons learned from this experience, and what steps are you taking to ensure that this breakdown in the chain of command never happens again?
Well, the key lessons were, first of all, as I've said, the transfer of authorities, I think we did what was done as it's supposed to be done and very quickly. What was not done right was the notification of key leaders. And so the lesson learned is that everyone in the environment and the process needs to have a clear understanding of what steps to follow for notification when things happen. And so the processes that we put in place ensure that that understanding is there, and that when something happens, that notification takes place in a very timely fashion.
And just to follow up, Secretary Austin, in terms of the transferring your position's authority, do you believe that there's room to grow in that area, just to make sure it's smoother and less opaque?
You know, I believe that there are things that we can do to make sure that the reason for the transfer of authority is crystal clear to everyone, and the steps that we've taken, the things that we put into place, ensure that there's written notification of why that transfer authority is taking place.
Thank you. Now yield back.
Chair, and I recognize the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Stefanik.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the morning of January 4th, Mr. Secretary, you were in the critical care unit, the acting Secretary of Defense was vacationing in Puerto Rico, and President Biden was unaware that you were not in the chain of command. Now, as you know, I represent Fort Drum in the 10th Mountain Division, which you know well. Thank you for your service there in the North Country. But on this same date of January 4th, do you know how many 10th Mountain Division soldiers were deployed and are still deployed today in Iraq and Syria in support of Operation Inherent Resolve?
You know, I know that they are deployed. I don't know what the number is.
It's just over 2,500. And on January 4th, at approximately 4 a.m. our time, the U.S. carried out a significant strike against a senior Iranian-backed leader in Iraq, correct?
That's correct.
And because President Biden did not know you were outside of the chain of command during this U.S. strike, if Iran or its proxies in Iraq or Syria had carried out a retaliatory strike against 10th Mountain Division soldiers, the president's chain of command would have and could have broken down, potentially delaying presidential orders to protect lives of American forces, constituents that I represent. Do you understand why this is unacceptable to the American people and to those military families?
Well, thanks. First of all, I would say that when we're attacked, we have the right to defend ourselves and respond immediately if it's a local attack. If a strike is warranted, then recommendations need to be provided to the president. Those recommendations come through from me, and after I've consulted with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and also the combatant commander. The Deputy Secretary would have done the same thing, and she has all of the capabilities and situational awareness to do that.
Except the president wasn't aware. The president of the United States was not aware that you were not in the chain of command. So God forbid there was a retaliatory strike.
Yeah,
that would have caused potential delays, and it is unacceptable. Let me ask you this. What disciplinary action would a junior service member face if he or she failed to properly notify their chain of command and failed to report for duty?
If if a service member was in a hospital, I think the chain of command would be concerned about why they were in a hospital and make sure that they're doing the right things to take care of them and their families.
But don't you think it's their responsibility to notify their commanding officer?
I think
the answer is yes.
Possible, yes. In my case, I would expect that my organization would do the right things to notify senior leaders if I am the patient in the hospital. Yeah.
It is unacceptable, and you have admitted as such that there was a breakdown in communication with the President of the United States. And I highlight the exact time, 4 a.m. January 4th, when you consider 10th Mountain Division soldiers and the potential for a retaliatory attack. That breakdown is unacceptable. And you said something very important. You said there was never a break in command and control. But yet the President of the United States was not aware that you were outside of the chain of the command. So is the President not a part of this command and control? Don't you believe that the Commander-in-Chief and the SecDef, that is critical for command and control?
He is clearly at the top of the chain in terms of command and control. But what's important is that we provide him with credible options and that he can pursue to address any situation. And it would have happened in this case because...
Except he was unaware. So what's important is the President was unaware of this breakdown in command and control, and you were not there in terms of who he would hear from.
Time's expired. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Moulton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I came to know prostate cancer as a child through my grandfather, and so at a very personal level, I hope for your speedy recovery, and I know that's a sentiment shared by everyone here today. And we are heartened to hear you are expected to be fully cured. Mr. Secretary, you and I were both trained as infantry officers, and I spent most of my time in the Marines, not as a general, but as a mere lieutenant. There are thousands of lieutenants serving under you in the military today. How would you advise a lieutenant to handle a situation like this with his or her command?
A situation in which they had one of their subordinates hospitalized,
or a lieutenant himself or herself were hospitalized.
Well, I would advise a lieutenant to make sure that they're doing everything to learn more about what happened, and also to ensure that we're taking care of that particular soldier. In terms of the failure to notify in a timely fashion, I would make sure that the lieutenant worked to put the right procedures and processes in place to ensure that his organization was able to inform him and inform his hire.
Mr. Secretary, I just returned from Japan and Taiwan, and I can't tell you how many leaders in Taipei and Tokyo asked us if we would fund Ukraine. They said that failing to fund Ukraine encourages Xi Jinping in China. Can you explain for the American people why standing up to Vladimir Putin and Russia alongside our European allies and funding Ukraine in their fight for democracy affects America's national security well beyond the borders of Ukraine itself?
Well, thanks. This really is about our security and the security of our allies and partners. And this really is about a rules-based international order. We don't want to live in a world where one country can redraw its neighbors' boundaries and illegitimately take over its sovereign territory. And so we know that if Putin is successful here, he will not stop. He will continue to take more aggressive action in the region. And other leaders around the world, other autocrats around the world will look at this and they'll be encouraged by the fact that, this happened and we failed to support a democracy. And so I think it's a very dangerous path to go down if we don't support Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Dr. Desjardins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Secretary Austin, very pleased to hear of your good prognosis and hope that your recovery continues to be uneventful and goes well for you. Just a couple questions. At the time you were in the hospital, there were several strikes carried out against militias in Iraq. What was your role in carrying out these operations? Were you calling the shots, or was DepSec Hicks making those decisions?
Well, on the 4th, as we have said earlier, that strike, I delegated the authority to conduct the strike when the conditions were right down to the combatant commander.
Okay.
On the 5th of January, I resumed my responsibilities, and I fully participated in all of the decisions that led up to subsequent actions.
I believe the American forces were attacked 8 times during your stay in the hospital. Had one of these attacks required a response on January 2nd, who would have made the call on that response?
It would have been, well, the President always makes the call, and it's based upon the input that he gets from
So who would have informed the President?
It would have been the Deputy Secretary of Defense, as she conferred with the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the combatant commander.
Okay, on the timeline, when did she know? Did she know on January 2nd that she was in charge?
She knew on January 2nd that we had transferred authority, yes.
When did she found out on January 2nd?
Yes, that information was clearly provided to her staff, and I'm sure she understood that. So.
Okay, now, a lot of times our staff are very loyal, as they should be, and some of the blame has been cast on your staff. Did you ever explicitly direct anyone to keep your condition from the White House on your staff?
As I said earlier, I never directed anyone to keep my hospitalization from the White House.
Okay, did you ever direct your staff or others to keep the status of your condition from the public or any other senior officials?
No.
It's been reported that when you returned to the hospital on January 1st, an aide told the dispatcher, "Can I ask that the ambulance not show up with lights and sirens? We're trying to remain subtle." Did you direct the aide to say that?
What I told my assistant to do was call an ambulance, and that's all that I told him to do.
Has anyone been disciplined for doing something that you did not tell them to do, namely actively suppressing information pertaining to your condition?
Again, as it pointed out in a 30-day review, there was a lot of things that happened, but there was no evidence of an intent to obfuscate or willingly conceal something. And so, at the end of the day, as I said earlier, I take full responsibility for this. We didn't get this right. We put the procedures in place to ensure that that this doesn't happen again.
Okay. Well, I respect that you take full responsibility. Let me ask you this, Secretary, and I'll finish with this. If a member of the Armed Services fails to report for duty and went missing for 4 days without informing their superior, they would likely face repercussions. Isn't that correct?
If, I would point out that I was in a military hospital in the Washington, D.C. area with...
But I'm talking about somebody, one of your subordinates. If they did that, they would face repercussions and perhaps even be dismissed depending on the circumstances, correct? If they didn't report for 4 days.
Yeah.
Okay. And so I'll just finally ask, why shouldn't you face some discipline under these circumstances? You put yourself above the man?
I do not, and I have, as you know, I served 41 years in the military in uniform, and so I understand the challenges, and I understand that, leaders have to set the example. Again, I said that we didn't get the notification right. Again, I was the patient, and so I expect that my organization
Gentleman's time's
would
expired.
do the right
Chair, I
thing to
recognize
notify
the
her.
gentleman from California, Mr. Khanna. Mr. Carvajal is here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Austin, thank you for being here today. There's no denying the situation regarding your health was not handled perfectly, and you've acknowledged that. That being said, to my knowledge, no laws were broken. There was no lapse in your ability to carry out your duties as Deputy Secretary Hicks was transferred authority in a timely manner. And it does remind me of when Democrats were in charge in October 2020, when then President Trump was telling the American people, downplaying COVID, telling the American people not to take the vaccination, telling the American people not to take certain treatments, but rather maybe Clorox or some things like that. And then lo and behold, as far as I am concerned, as a veteran myself, there's nothing else